This is the season of creation. It began on September 1. This was a designation that the former ecumenical patriarch designated. So it's the month of September, essentially. It starts on September 1, and it ends on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi on October the 4th. It's an ecumenical celebration of God's beautiful creation and our responsibility to care for it. We launched the 2023 season of creation with a global online service that I took part on from the road, took part in, and we had 5,000 people from all over the world online to start this year's season of creation. So I brought a prayer to begin us today. It's not the typical gathering prayer for a church group. It's a prayer from a rabbi, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who lived from 1772 to 1810. And it was shared with me by my teacher and dear friend, Robert McDermott. So may God be with you. Let us pray. Grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day among the trees and grass, among all growing things, and there may I be alone and enter into prayer, to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all grasses, trees, and plants, awake at my coming to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so that my prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source. May I then pour out the words of my heart before your presence like water, O God, and lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of all the family of God. Amen. Welcome to this webinar that is the work of our wonderful canon, Michelle Racusin, and our wonderful canon, Stephanie Martin-Taylor, and really quite a few people from diocesan staff and the leadership of the Diocese of California. Thank you all for joining and being part of this.
Thank you, Bishop Mark. And our apologies again for the delayed start. We're still trying to get Lane Ringley on as well, so I'm going to be working on that. But I will turn it over now to Canon Michelle and let you take it from here.
Okay, so the piece that I'm going to do is the budget, and I'm wondering, Christopher, if you want to start so that we can cue this up.
I'd be happy to start if that works for everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So let me see if I can succeed in sharing you what I want you all to look at while I'm speaking to you. So hopefully you can all see that. Thumbs up, Michelle.
Great, thanks.
You can see it. Good. All right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Hayes. I serve as the Chancellor of the Diocese of California. And in plain English, that means
Ministro de la Diócesis de California.
For the diocese, and I've been asked to speak with you for a few minutes about the purpose for the diocese.
Hace su presentación acerca de los propósitos de la diócesis.
Presentation to you down into two big parts. First,
voy a dividir mi presentación en dos partes. Haré lo mejor para mostrarles, por mostrarle gráficas en vez de tantas palabras. Espero que esto les ayude a visualizar lo que trato de decir. ¿Cómo pueden ustedes tomar parte en el presupuesto del proceso de la diócesis? Hablaremos más al final.
When I answer that question,
¿Qué
ask another
paga por
question.
la
How does the
evaluación?
assessment relate to who we are as a church?
¿Cómo se relaciona
And that's
la
an important
evaluación
question
de lo que
because we govern
somos?
ourselves differently and we relate to each other differently than in many other churches.
Todos nos
And
relacionamos de
so I
diferente
break that
manera
down into three major subject areas that you see on the screen.
y
First
lo que
area
ustedes
is
ven en la
doctrine and
pantalla.
ecclesiology. Doctrine, of course, is the teaching of the church, what we believe as Christians. And ecclesiology is a study of how the church is organized. So part of our discussion
La
is about
eclesiología
how we
es cómo
see
se
the diocese's
organiza la
role as
iglesia.
part of the church's doctrine and ecclesiology.
La
The
doctrina,
second
la
area
eclesiología,
is oversight and accountability. In any organization, people entrusted with important
la
responsibilities need
vigilancia y la
oversight for how they carry
responsabilidad
out their work
de la
on behalf of
diócesis.
the whole. An organization also needs ways to hold people accountable when there are problems in how they carry out their responsibilities. So the second part of our discussion is the role that the diocese plays in that oversight and
¿Qué
accountability.
papel juega la
And then the
diócesis
third
en la
area is
vigilancia,
diocesis
en la
support,
contabilidad, en la
congregational ministry.
responsabilidad?
Now, some people might think that that's all the assessment does or all that it should pay for, but I would disagree with that. But in the area of diocesan support, we're talking mainly about things that the diocese is better suited to provide than expecting congregations to do for themselves. Now, these categories are just to help us think about things. There are no clear boundaries between them. You can debate what category to put something into. That doesn't really matter for today. The categories I'm offering to you just to help you think about what the diocese does.
¿Qué es lo que
So
hace?
let's
¿Quiere
start with
explicarnos
doctrine
qué es
and
lo que hace la
ecclesiology.
diócesis?
The Episcopal Church is a hierarchical church, which means that we have multiple levels of authority. Every
Tenemos
congregation is
diferentes niveles de
obviously
autoridad.
part
La
of the
iglesia tiene
basic
diferentes
territorial
niveles
jurisdiction
de
of the church, which
autoridad.
is the diocese. The diocese, in
Es lo que
turn,
hace la
is part of a
diócesis.
denomination, the Episcopal Church. That's the highest level of our governance, but it's not the highest level of our membership in our tradition. The Episcopal Church is part of the
Primero
Anglican
está,
Communion,
claro,
which
la
is
diócesis de
a group of
California,
about 40
la iglesia
denominational churches
episcopal
operating in more than
y la comunión
165 countries.
anglicana, que es la
And although it
doctrina,
doesn't play a
las
governing role,
partes
it
en que se
does make
divide
us
la
into the
iglesia, la
third largest
doctrina, la
body of ministry worldwide,
eclesiología.
connecting us to people in all parts of the globe. So what makes
Todo
this
esto nos
possible?
conecta con gente de
All
todas
levels of the
partes del
Episcopal
mundo.
Church, whether we're talking about congregations or dioceses or the whole Episcopal Church,
Hablamos de congregaciones o diócesis.
Your
La
congregation is the
característica
local
principal
presence of the
es
Episcopal Church and of the diocese
sobre
in
la
your community. So congregational giving
sobre
makes it all possible. There are some other sources of income like endowments, but they play only a small role. And the Episcopal Church, in turn, also helps fund the Anglican Communion. So all the levels we just talked about ultimately get their funding in part from congregational giving. So why do we have this hierarchy?
¿Qué
Well, since
tenemos
ancient
esta
times, we
jerarquía?
believe that the fullest expression of the church is the people of God gathered with their clergy and their bishop.
¿Cuál es el
This makes
propósito?
the
El
diocese
propósito
the
que
basic
Dios nos
local
dice que
expression of the
todas
church,
estas
the smallest level,
congregaciones
where you
se
find
reúnen
all orders
en
of
favor de
ministry,
la
all
gente.
the baptized together with their priests, their deacons, and their bishops.
Todos están bautizados por el ministro de la
The
iglesia.
diocese makes local ministry possible, and one primary way is by training and ordaining clergy. The diocese sponsors the recruitment, discernment, and
La
formation of
diócesis se
ordained
hace
ministry of our
responsable
priests and deacons.
del
So we have priests and
reclutamiento y
deacons because the
entrenamiento
diocese is
de
here
los
to make
futuros
that happen.
ministros.
Some new clergy come to us from other dioceses or even from other denominations. And here again, the diocese has a responsibility for licensing and credentialing clergy, enabling them to serve in local congregations. Diocese also makes church-wide ministry possible. Diocese pays its own assessment to the Episcopal Church to fund
La
church-wide
diócesis paga sus
ministry,
propias
as well as ministry in
evaluaciones.
particular locations that we have a shared responsibility to support.
Tenemos y tienen que compartir la responsabilidad de las otras iglesias de la diócesis, de la comunión
And the
anglicana.
Episcopal Church in turn helps fund the Anglican Communion. The diocese also provides some resources for
La
services
diócesis
beyond the immediate community.
provee de
As one
recursos.
example, Consider Episcopal Community Services, which provides the Ministry of Housing and
como
Employment training
servicios
to
a la
homeless and very
comunidad,
low-income people in San Francisco and Marin.
entrenamiento
It's a ministry that's too large
a la
for any
gente
one
que llega a la
congregation to
iglesia
handle. Now, this
de la
ministry
congregación
has
de
its
San
own budget and its own
Francisco.
budget process, but there are other examples that we could talk about that where the
Hay
diocese plays a
hay
direct
muchas formas
financial
en que la iglesia ayuda y podemos hablar de
So
eso.
let's move on to the second major role for the diocese, which is oversight and accountability. A major area for oversight
La
is
vigilancia y la
accountability.
responsabilidad de la
Congregations
diócesis
must submit
es algo
reports on their
muy
finances as
importante.
part of their annual parochial
Checar
report.
sobre las
Since the
finanzas.
federal and state governments play very little role in regulating churches for fiscal responsibility,
So, el
the
Estado
church must largely
Estado
regulate
participa
itself.
muy poco en esto, en
Here, the
estos
diocese plays major
presupuestos.
roles in educating local leaders about their financial responsibilities and in helping correct any problems
Los
when they arise.
líderes de las iglesias deben tener sus propias
Legal accountability is
responsabilidades.
another area that's very near and dear to my
La
heart.
responsabilidad legal es algo
One
muy
reason is that the law
importante
applies differently in
en
some ways
todas
to
las
churches
iglesias.
than to any other private organization. So through my office, the diocese provides some basic guidance to all congregations.
La
Although
iglesia provee
generally
guías
expected to retain their
básicas
own counsel for significant issues.
para
But
tener
I
una vigilancia sobre la
trust the diocese's
responsabilidad
counsel to help them in
de
areas
la
that
de la
may
iglesia
require,
para ayudar
some
a la
expertise from
gente.
me. The diocese provides somewhat greater support to mission congregations
La
because of their
diócesis
generally more limited
provee
resources.
de una ayuda muy amplia para
One
todas las
aspect of
personas.
legal accountability is known as Title IV.
Uno de los
refers to the
aspectos de
section
la
of the canons of the
responsabilidad y
Episcopal Church that
vigilancia
concerns discipline of clergy for any
es
alleged
proveer
immoral conduct. By
disciplina, buena
design,
conducta.
clergy discipline does not take place in the local congregation. It takes
La
place at the
indisciplina no
level of
tiene
the
lugar en la
diocese.
congregación.
Removing clergy discipline from the local congregation serves several purposes. First, it makes it easier to provide fair procedure for both the accused cleric and the person alleging an injury. Second, it also protects the local congregation, especially if questions are raised about whether the congregation provided effective oversight. And it leaves the congregation in a position to focus as much as possible on continuing to provide its regular mission and ministry. Third, it protects other congregations. If a member of the clergy is
La
found
diócesis
responsible
protege
for
otras
misconduct, he or she cannot just
congregaciones.
move to another position without the matter being properly addressed. And finally, the diocese bears most of the expense for the process, which can in some cases be considerable.
So, la diócesis corre con la mayor parte de los
So
gastos.
that now brings me to the third major
Entonces,
focus of the diocese's work, which is support for congregational ministry. And that is overseen by the people you see in this lovely photo. Now, of course, the bishop supervises all of this work, but most of the time you'll be in contact with the bishop's senior staff, and I'm going to name check some of them as I'm talking about their work. And I'm only going to talk very briefly about the major areas of diocesan support for congregational ministry. So
voy a hablar un poco solamente de la ayuda congregacional de la diócesis.
For the full scope of your work, just an overview. And if I get something wrong, blame me. So first area, support for mission congregations and congregational vitality. This comes mainly from the
Apoyo total a la congregación.
As you probably know, aside from the cathedral, our congregations fall into two major categories.
Hay dos categorías
generally able to
grandes.
afford at least one full-time priest, and missions, which generally have clergy
Proveer de
who are paid for less than full-time work.
un ministro de tiempo completo
She also helps all congregations with
que
vitality,
hace
with multicultural issues, and with
las
conflict resolution and
responsabilidades
crisis management, especially in
multiculturales de
their
todos
conflicts
los
between
agregados.
clergy and lay leaders. A second area is transition ministry. And from
El
time to
ministro
time,
de
every
transición
congregation needs to find a new rector, a new vicar, or a new associate clergy.
necesitan encontrar un nuevo rector.
Helps congregations and new clergy find each other, which she's done more than 130 times since 2009. Denise
Que se ayudan entre ellos mismos desde hace mucho tiempo.
That's important for clergy to get their pensions when it's time for retirement.
Y es importante para ellos, sobre todo cuando llegue el tiempo de la jubilación. Para mí, la licencia profesional es muy importante para ver si estoy calificado para hacer el trabajo, todo el trabajo que tengo que hacer en la Iglesia de California. En el tercer área,
Canon Amy Cook and Karen Miles have a broad portfolio that includes all mandated training, such as anti-racism training, safe church, Eucharistic
tercero es que el ministro debe de
ministers,
estar en contra del racismo,
relations with our two camps and conference centers, the Bishop's
una buena relación con los otros ministros.
University of California, Berkeley, at Stanford, and at San Francisco State University.
Estos tres lugares tienen que estar en común acuerdo.
Fourth area is finance, overseen by Canon Michelle Rakusin, who you'll hear from shortly.
Las finanzas encargadas de todo esto a cargo de Michelle Rakusin, que ya les explicará.
Operations, accounting methods, parochial reports, clergy discretionary funds, budget questions, internal controls, internal audit.
Todos estos asuntos relacionados con las finanzas serán atendidos, cualquier pregunta por Michelle Rakusin. Todo lo relacionado con el presupuesto.
Employment law and overtime rules, and they will often bring questions to me as they are appropriate.
Cualquier duda, preguntas serán llevadas a mí personalmente.
Such as endowments and trusts. A fifth area is stewardship, which is overseen by Canon David Gerhardt.
En quinto lugar,
webinars, consultations, preaching, and
hacer todas las cosas que necesitamos hacer.
Those include pledge campaigns, event-based fundraising, special ministry fundraising, and capital campaigns. And that office
todo lo relacionado con esto, el fundraising, juntar el dinero para las necesidades de la iglesia.
Hundreds of trusts, annuities, and endowments, which is long-term work, sometimes spanning many years. And this is a function that our diocese has that is either entirely absent in many dioceses or is much more of newly created than in ours. It's been going on here for several decades. And Davy's work is funded mostly by endowment and by fees that come from maintaining estate gifts. A sixth area is communications, which is overseen by Canon Stephanie Martin Taylor and Ellie Simpson. And their office provides congregations a range of consulting work, including media relations, crisis communications, coaching for writing.
En un sexto punto, estas personas podrán ayudarnos en todo lo relacionado con las cosas que tenemos que hacer, como las reuniones, webinars y toda la información que debe estar en la media sobre lo que se hace en eso.
So that completes what I wanted to present about what the assessment pays for. And if you're,
esto es más o menos de lo que se hace cargo la evaluación que debemos llevar. Y espero que cada uno de ustedes esté trabajando y hablar sobre sus evaluaciones, las valoraciones que ustedes hacen en sus respectivos lugares. Tenemos una fórmula que ayuda a pagar.
So I'm afraid I've run out of pictures. Now it's just words. So here are the words.
Okay.
The words are important ones. The canons of the diocese, which are our ecclesiastical laws, govern how we adopt the assessment formula. And the canons do two things here. First,
El canon,
set some fundamental requirements for the assessment formula. And second, they establish
cosas requeridas para la fórmula de la evaluación. Empecemos con lo más fundamental, los requisitos fundamentales. Primero,
for the diocesan budget. So that's pretty straightforward. All that means, and it's important, is that we have to plan for a balanced budget every year. We don't
Tenemos
take in more
que
assessment
tenemos
revenue
que
than
planear por
we
nuestro
expect to
balance
spend, and we
anual
don't spend more than we expect to
para
with
no
assessment revenue.
para no gastar más
Second, as a matter of both
de nuestros
fairness among
fondos.
congregations and the integrity
Segundo,
of the information that we're using, the assessment is based on the total
proveer
operating
la
income
información
that each
sobre las
congregation reports
evaluaciones que se
on its
están
most
haciendo
recent available parochial report. Now, there's some adjustments to
para
this
tener
number for
un
mission
reporte propio
congregations, for the cathedral,
sobre
given its unique role and its cost structure, and
las
for parishes and
cosas
missions
que
that
se están
create new
haciendo.
program staff positions. But in essence, it's based on the operating income on the parochial report, so the same number for every congregation driving that formula. Third,
Lo importante es
a
seguir
fundamental
la
requirement,
fórmula de la
the
evaluación.
Finance Committee must recommend a schedule of percentages for at least
El
two
comité
levels
debe
of
recomendar la
operating
hora
income for every
en los
congregation.
niveles en que se
So
está
that means the
operando.
assessment is not a flat rate. A flat rate would tend to favor big congregations over small ones.
Un promedio regular
We don't have
debe
that. By
mantenerse
having at
todo el
least
tiempo.
two rates in a progressive rate structure, we're able to have a little more variation. And by long-standing custom,
Y con
we
esto
have
podemos
set the
tener
assessment
más
at a
variación,
much lower rate on the first tranche of
promedio
income
más
that's
bajo.
sufficient to provide the minimum compensation for one full-time priest, and we have a higher rate that applies to income above that amount. So sometimes you see the top line percentage of the assessment formula, because it's a blended rate, nobody actually pays the top
La
line
fórmula de la
of the
evaluación
formula.
provee
Everyone
lo
has a lower
lo
effective
que
rate for their
puede
assessment.
ganar
So finally,
un
let's
ministro
turn
de
to
la
the
iglesia,
process.
que puede ganar
Any
menos.
proposed change to the assessment formula must be provided to the Finance Committee by April 1st. And the reason here is to help the Finance
La
Committee
evaluación
carry out that first fundamental requirement.
debe
when
ser
proposing
proporcionada al
the budget.
Departamento de
If the assessment
Finanzas,
formula is changed, the expense
máximo
budget
para el
also
1
has
de
to be
abril,
changed,
supongo que del
and it's
próximo
not
año.
feasible to do that on the floor of the convention. So as a
Ajá.
matter of fair process, proposed changes to the assessment formula have to be submitted by April 1st, so that's about 6 months in advance of the convention, and that allows it to be fed into the entire budget process.
Para
So
que
then
pueda
the Finance
entrar al
Committee
proceso
must, and I'm quoting from the canon here,
del
quote,
presupuesto
"consider the
general de la
potential
iglesia.
effect of the proposed amendment on the diocesan operating fund and the operations of the diocese, and report its conclusions to the diocesan convention prior to any vote on the proposed amendment." So in effect, all those words mean that the convention must debate and vote first on the budget for the diocesan operating fund. So what functions are we going to fund each year? Once that is approved, the convention must then approve an assessment formula that pays in full.
La comisión debe proveer una evaluación
That covers
que nosotros
everything that I
podamos seguir.
wanted to present to you today, and
Es todo lo que quiero
if
decir,
there
la
is
fórmula
time,
de la
I'm happy to
evaluación.
take, and the moderators allow, I'm happy to try to respond to questions now, or if
Si tienen preguntas
several want
ahora
to
o
do it at a later point, I'm happy to do
después.
that as well.
Yes, Christopher, please go ahead and answer questions. We're still trying to get Lane on our back end, so take your time and answer all the questions that come in.
All
Do you need
right.
help? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing questions coming in yet, so start typing those questions.
Todos están esperando por las preguntas.
Hi, this is Karen. I see Gary Perkins has his hand raised, but Gary, if you can type your question into the Q&A box, that's going to be easier way for us to answer.
Si alguien puede escribir las preguntas para que podamos todos leerlas.
Okay, so the first question is from Lenora Olivas. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from St. Anne's in Fremont. And will the slides be available later? Yeah, I'll be happy to put out a version of the slides if anybody wants to have those as a keepsake. Second question is from the very Reverend Deb White at Grace Martinez. I understand why the assessment is adjusted for missions. Why is the assessment adjusted for Grace Cathedral? And the answer is basically that the cathedral is a shared responsibility of the diocese and the wider community. Its budget is unlike any other congregation's budget. Its congregation pays for, I think, something around 20 to 25% of the cathedral's entire operating expenses. So it's simply in a different financial category in the way that it operates. And it wouldn't be possible to have the third largest cathedral in the diocese if it were subject to the same formula. So it's always had a special formula, and that's written into the canons. And there are a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to try, I'm hoping for some help in answering some of these, because there are some people who are better suited to answer them than I am. So next one from Christine Nadeau, who serves on the finance committee and how are they chosen?
Sí, haciendo
I'm going to refer
preguntas
to
sobre,
the canon on that,
sobre la evaluación.
because it is defined by canon. The finance committee has a chair and 4 other members who are appointed by the bishop with the advice and consent of the executive council. There are 2 more members that are appointed by the executive council itself. And there are ex officio members who don't have a vote, who are the treasurer of the diocese, Lane Ringley, the chief financial officer of the diocese, Michelle Rakusin, and the chancellor of the diocese, that's me. So we're the ones, and so those last 3 don't have a vote. I just get to go up and share my opinions.
Estas 3 personas son las que tienen la capacidad de responder estas preguntas.
Let me find another question that I can answer. There's a question from Richard Mills about how the diocese's assessment formula compares with the assessment formulas from around the country, and I'm hoping that Lane can answer that when he's ready. Oh, and there he is. Hello, Lane. And Michelle, do you want to help me with some of these questions before we move on to the next presentation?
Michelle, ¿quieres ayudar con?
Brad Barber, Arthur Perkins, Chip Larimore, Bob McCaskill. Am I missing anybody?
Yeah, so you're naming the members of the finance committee. Great, that's
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Los nombres del
And
comité
then
financiero.
I'll take another question. Eric Machwaye, the Reverend
Hay
Eric
otra
Machwaye, the very Reverend
pregunta.
Eric Machwaye asks, in parishes, I've heard the assessment referred to as a tax. What's the difference? Well, the one difference is that it is part of our shared responsibility to each other as a church. It is part of how it's the only way that we can operate the basic local jurisdiction of the church as a collective. Another way that it's different is that you can't negotiate with the IRS. At least good luck trying. If a congregation is having trouble,
Si la congregación está teniendo problemas con la evaluación, no podemos luchar contra el IRS.
Having a rough spot can be relieved of part of its assessment or even its entire assessment for a period of time so that it can recover.
Todo esto puede ser parte de nuestra evaluación. Y muchas congregaciones están tomando ventaja de esto.
So that's a way in which we share ministry together.
La forma en que nosotros compartimos todo el ministerio juntos.
Do you want me to pick up the one on the total income of assessments changing over the past 5 years?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the assessment, the funds that are provided for ministries from the
La
assessment
evaluación que es
have been relatively flat, although there has
proporcionada.
been a slight upward trajectory. And you'll see an example of this when we go over the budget in a few minutes.
Ha sido muy plana sobre el presupuesto últimamente. No ha crecido bastante.
Is there anything else outside
There's a question from Ann Castells about Episcopal Community Services being supported by the diocese. It doesn't have direct revenue from the diocese. It did for many years rely heavily on the diocese's line of credit to make its payroll, because its income coming from largely
Se
from
discute
contracts
acerca de
with the
cómo
city
se
government
manejan
of
las
Cusco, which
finanzas,
paid
cómo
many
afecta
months after the
la
fact.
nómina,
So
y tenemos que ser muy
we play a big role in
cuidadosos
that.
con el
They've
IRS.
since moved on to another financing method for their payroll, so we're not as directly involved in the financial sense. But their board, like all diocesan institutions, is required to have a majority of Episcopalians. The bishop is an ex officio member of the board. So there are a number of ways of diocesan involvement there. And it exists because we founded it. It wouldn't have and it exists because of resources that we helped provide it at the outset. So that's I hope that's answers the question.
Hay más preguntas sobre las
I
evaluaciones.
think the majority of the other ones will be answered in Lane's presentation on the assessment review.
I think you're
Supone
right,
que todos
Michelle. And if
contestarán.
not, we can address some of the questions at the conclusion of the presentation, at least.
Okay, so I'm gonna leave the questions that are in the queue up and available for us
Voy
to
a
get back
hacer
to after the next presentation.
las preguntas.
And apologies to the participants. I've been having some technical difficulties and
Mis
had
disculpas para
to
los
jump in here.
participantes
So,
que hemos
if you
tenido
bear with me
problemas
while I
técnicos.
share.
While you're queuing up, I just want to kind of loop back to the assessment relief, because if you will recall, there was over $750,000 raised and given to congregations for assessment relief over the last couple of years, primarily during the COVID crisis. I have not heard of another diocese who has been able to do this. So this was something that's been just an awesome thing that this diocese has done for our congregations. Lane, you're on mute.
At this point, I apologize.
Do you want me to pull up the slides?
Yeah, that actually would be great, Michelle. Thank
Creo,
you.
Okay.
creo que hay algunos problemas técnicos que no se pueden ver.
You can probably flip right to the beginning. And if you could just expand the screen to presentation mode, that would be great. That'll
Okay.
help everybody. There should be a little icon in the lower right that you can click,
Repaso de la fórmula de la evaluación.
or on the view
Okay.
full
Well,
screen
hold
would be
on.
great.
View. It's not like I've never used PowerPoint before, crying out loud. Is that better? Or?
Actually, if you can, is there a
Slideshow. Here we
icon?
go. Slideshow. Here we
Okay,
go.
Right.
From beginning. Here we go. Okay, are you good?
I think that's probably as good as we're going to get.
Okay. Okay.
So thank you for bearing with our technical challenges this evening. It certainly has an impact on the blood pressure. The discussion of the assessment review or assessment formula, at least, and the budget.
Están hablando sobre la fórmula
Started at the
de
last
la
convention,
evaluación.
and there was some great dialogue and conversation regarding
Era un
that. And
repaso.
we've been doing research since that time on what other dioceses are doing from the standpoint of how their assessment formulas are structured overall. And Michelle, maybe you can flip to the first slide. It would be great.
Estamos investigando si las otras diócesis están haciendo lo mismo.
Did it do it?
So the process, Finance Committee, CFO, myself, there was also an assessment review or assessment task force established by the Executive Council to help with guiding the
Un repaso de la
process
fórmula
overall. And as
de la
part of the
valoración
board in terms of
después
methodology and
del
approach
130
overall.
aniversario de la
Maybe you
convención.
can flip to the next page.
It didn't do it, huh? Okay, hold on.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
I think we're good.
Oh, you're on the second one?
Yeah, if you can flip
Oh.
forward, great.
Okay, to the third one? Okay.
So to compare and evaluate the Diacal's assessment formula, we started with establishing a peer group of other dioceses that we thought from a total standpoint would be comparable, at least to provide some facts for
Establecido un grupo de
decision
19
overall.
diócesis comparables
This group of
de sus
dioceses,
pares, un
which
grupo de pares
Diacal's essentially right in the middle
para-
when you look at it in terms of
para elaborar la
revenues,
fórmula de evaluación,
recommendations, and others. So we try to size it accordingly
identificar
as to how others
las
would
fórmulas
size
actuales
their
para
peer
cada uno
groups
de los
for other
de las
purposes,
diócesis
looking at
pares,
operational performance,
eh,
financial performance, or other types of criteria overall.
y
And then once we
coleccionar los
identified
datos en la escala
the
de
19
cada,
dioceses, we went
de
through
cada
a
uno,
fairly manual
cada uno de
effort
sus
to
pares.
identify current assessment formulas and process for each diocese, and then collected data on the scope and scale of each diocese to make sure that we were at least developing what we thought was a representative sample for comparison purposes. You can flip forward, Michelle. Some of the key findings from this, and we'll get into obviously the details in a minute. We did find that in terms of overall approach and structure for the formula itself, Diacal actually aligns very well
El
with
Diacal usa
we would call them
un tipo de fórmula más predominante, más reciente
in terms of using the most recent year
de las finanzas parroquiales.
Two, the fact that we use a tiered formula.
El uso de una red operacional de ingresos en la línea A.
We then apply our formula of 5% on the first roughly 89,000.
Diacal depende menos de los ingresos patrimoniales de sus pares.
After that, the assessment formula rate of 17% on amounts in excess of 89,742. And that 89,742
son pequeñas dotaciones. Son más pesadas en los ingresos de la valoración.
Those breakpoints differ broadly in terms of the formulas that they use overall. And just as a reminder,
Fórmulas encontradas, resultados claves de todo esto.
We did find as we looked through the financial information is that Diacal relies less on endowment income and frankly more on assessment revenue than the others. And you'll see that in a few moments when we show some comparisons. So hence we have a smaller endowment income.
Michelle es gonna explicarnos otras cosas porque tenemos dotaciones más pequeñas.
In addition, when we look at applying the peer formulas to our financials, it generally results in slightly higher assessments, and that does vary
de los resultados clave.
Size because the formulas differ quite substantially.
Aplicando por las fórmulas de pareja del Diacal, generalmente los resultados en valoraciones más altas varía por el tamaño de los pares. Hay un impacto modelado de las fórmulas de pareja en las finanzas parroquiales. Las fórmulas en pareja resultado de una valoración comparable más pequeñas. parejas, grupos de
So the use
parejas,
of a peer group and peer diocese was intended to create
parejas de diócesis.
comparable in essence.
Crea
to
un grupo comparable al
So
diocesano.
we sized this and chose
Varía en tamaño.
the other dioceses, of which there
El
are
total
19 total,
ingreso
just
es
to name
de
one.
sí,
So that
número de
diocese essentially equivalent to
congregaciones.
total revenues, number of congregations, and that the
La
range is
composición de
roughly
la
around
diócesis
half as many as we
que
have,
cubre las
half
zonas
the size
urbanas y
we have,
las
two
geografías
times
urbanas
the
y
revenue size and two
suburbanas.
times the congregations. We looked at dioceses that had both urban and suburban geographies. And we also looked at dioceses that had retreat centers and schools. So the goal was essentially to center the peer group medians roughly where Diacal is. Maybe you can flip forward. This will give you an
Las
example
diócesis
of
se
the 19
recuperan.
other dioceses that we selected.
Oops,
Just go back one.
sorry.
We'll just pause here for a second.
Continuación
You can
de
see
grupo de pares en
there's
estos
some of the
lugares.
West Coast that we focused on and included, but
La
also
costa
others
oeste,
across the nation that we thought were representative comparisons for us overall. Certainly with any peer group, you can pick one or two or three of any peer organizations and say that, well, that's not necessarily a good fit for us. What we're trying to look is create in totality a peer group that we think is comparable, not necessarily picking one or two. Can you move forward? Data collection, fairly involved effort beginning the end of last year through mid this year, where we looked at convention materials, other reports, outreach to other dioceses, to validate assessment formulas, collected scope data, both financial and organizational data, revenues, endowment income, number of congregations and staff, and then also retreat centers and schools. Some of this is, I wouldn't say we had 100% data for every diocese, and we did have to do some outreach. Some were responsive, some not. Otherwise, we used convention materials and other materials that were available to us to actually summarize the data for ourselves.
habla de la recopilación de datos usando materiales convencionales.
Go back one.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
La escala del grupo en
peer
par.
group were roughly right about the median in terms of total revenues, and that revenues would be all assessment revenues, endowment income, other types of incomes, interest income and such. So we're looking to be right about the median, which we were in terms of revenues, and we were pretty close to the median in terms of number of congregations in each diocese. Although there's obviously a broad range overall. And then we look at type of assessment formula. One of the
tipos de evaluación, la fórmula, tipos de elaboración de la fórmula, pares de la diócesis que son cada divididas entre dos, plana y poco torcida. Básicamente la fórmula que se ve en la pantalla.
Others are tiered like Diacal, and the tiered ones are in the blue, which represents just slightly over half of the organizations overall. So it was roughly split 50-50, but slightly higher tilt towards those that have what we call a progressive rate structure.
Continúa con la tipo de valoración, la forma de
valoración. Use what we refer to as a current year approach to defining financials for which the assessment formula is then applied. As an example of the counter, which would be in the orange, which is about slightly over a third of them.
So, la mayoría de las diócesis usa el año más actual, cercano a la definición financiera de la valoración aplicación, de un año actual aproximado.
A disadvantage for a trailing average is that if you're at a high point in terms of revenues, that's going to drive the average up, and it's a little less sensitive to changes in congregational financial position.
La parte azul es el estado actual de la fórmula de este tipo de evaluación.
With the most current year financial approach for applying the assessment formula overall. And next. And there were a variety of financials that were defined for application of the formula. Obviously, line A from the Procure report was probably one of the most common overall, and that's the approach that DACA has. Others use line B, total operating revenue, and there were even other definitions of income or revenue, but no real prevalent approach in that last category overall. So our conclusion from this is we're probably in the largest group overall in terms of prevalence of type of financial that we're using to apply the formula to, although there are certainly other types that are being used by other dioceses.
De
I
la
just
forma que
add
están
one thing,
usando las
Elaine?
diócesis,
The
es decir,
difference
teniendo
between using
éxito.
line A and line B is that line B includes support for missions. So if you're a mission and you're receiving support from the diocese, that amount is assessed. DIOCAL doesn't do that. So we use the NOI before the mission support.
One of the data points that we collected was endowment income, since that is the other more significant form of revenues that each diocese uses then to provide and fund services for congregations. Obviously, assessment income being the other overall. And as you can see from this, when looking at endowment income as a percentage of total revenues overall, that DIOCAL actually obtains less from endowment income than the others, and hence there's a greater emphasis and reliance upon assessment income. What's a quick takeaway from this is, if we're going to reduce our emphasis and need for assessment revenue, and which would preclude us from reducing the assessment formula in the future, the only way we can potentially rearrange that is by increasing the income we get from the endowment, absent any changes to the budget overall. So I think this is one area that we, the Finance Committee, is certainly focused on, that endowment income can reduce the assessment burden on congregations if we build that going forward. We move forward.
Modelando las fórmulas de la
I think I've
valoración.
probably covered this page. Certainly others have, higher levels of endowment, hence higher levels of endowment income and less of reliance upon assessment revenues overall. Next page. Whoop.
I think that's it. Did you have another? Did you add to the pages?
Yes.
Sorry, I have an old version.
Okay. So I'm gonna ad lib here as we kind of continue some of our technical challenges. I did mention earlier that we did model the assessment formulas a couple of different ways. One, looking at what if we applied the peer formulas to DIOCAL financials, and that generally results in just a slightly higher dollar assessment overall. Although there's a wide range, and I wish I could show you the beautiful chart that we have to demonstrate that overall. When we looked at modeling the peer assessment formulas on some illustrative DIOCAL congregations overall, using an assumed level of line A revenues overall, we tested on 3 different sizes: line A of 250,000, 500,000, and $1 million. And what we found was that for the smallest congregation at about 250,000, DIOCAL was right about the median, almost spot on to the median of the peer group. And actually there was a fairly small range around that median. So the variability was actually quite small. When we increased that to 500,000 line A overall, the DIOCAL formula actually charges an assessment that's about 9% above median. And there is a much wider range of outcomes looking at that data overall. And not surprisingly, given the structure of our formula, which has a low 5% for the first 89,000 and 17%, When we look at the largest illustrative congregation of about 1 million in line A, the assessment amounts for DICAL are about 15% above median. And there is an even greater variation overall, looking at the peer organizations. So I think just to wrap up quickly, and we'll get right to your questions. One, I think we found DICAL uses the most prevalent type of formula, use a tiered formula versus flat, use the most recent year financials for the parishes versus a trailing average. We use line A, as Michelle indicated, of net operating income overall. Assessment amounts based upon our analyses are comparable to the peers for small and medium congregations, but higher for the larger overall.
Pues en general las valoraciones de la fórmula parecen, el sistema financiero de la diócesis parece estar bien. A veces las dotaciones son más pequeñas, pero pues en general parece que todo está bien.
Continue for the time being with the current assessment formula. Look to build the
Parece
endowment
que
principal and income received.
la fórmula
That can come via a
parece
variety
estar
of
funcionando.
sources, either gifts, which we tend to be light on gifts for endowment purposes.
Sí, no podemos
Going through a process
depender
of several
de
congregations,
regalos,
the unfortunate
pero
experience of having to close congregations. And it's painful for everyone. But when
las congregaciones ayudan mucho.
Principal from sales of properties, we should prioritize that principal.
Cuando hay venta de propiedades, debemos priorizar
emphasis on assessment income going forward.
en
And we should revisit the assessment formula to reduce the burden on congregations. And as we can, this is a conversation. This is not a one and done, but one that started at convention and should continue over the next few years as we focus on not only the assessment formula, we focus on certainly our budget, we focus on building the principal and the endowment.
creo que es muy importante para todas las diócesis el saber perfecto usar esta fórmula de valoración que parece estar funcionando. Que parece estar funcionando correctamente sobre estas cantidades. 9 millones es muchísimo dinero. Y si trabajamos con esto, pues posiblemente podemos llegar a nuestras metas en el futuro. Podemos tener más preguntas, más discusiones sobre esto. Y disculpas por todos los problemas técnicos y lo tardío de este webinar.
Are we voting on any changes to the assessment at the convention this year? No, there's no proposed change, no resolution that I'm aware of, at least, and Christopher, correct me if I'm wrong. But if we do propose changes down the road, I hope we do it from a fact-based position, looking at not only our budget needs, what other dioceses are doing, the structure and impact, and not simply pull a formula out of the air.
So I agree with that, and I'm going to add on to the question.
Estoy de acuerdo.
Actually, maybe you're
Voy a
better suited to answer this.
Agregar a una pregunta.
From Laura Gable.
Quiero hacer una pregunta.
She said, "Hi, Christopher. What variables does the Finance Committee consider when evaluating an amendment to the assessment formula?" And I think the answer is
acerca de la fórmula de valoración.
Reviewed for you. His study group modeled what the effect of other dioceses formulas would be, both on the diocese.
¿Cuáles son los efectos de la fórmula de evaluación de otras diócesis? ¿Cómo afectaría en caso de usarse a las otras congregaciones? Una pregunta sólida.
Your question or request to see a chart of the DICAL's data versus 19 other dioceses. I would love to. I've got it on 2 computers, and for some reason I can't get the presentation up. So my apologies.
Entiendo tu pregunta.
Stacy Gross
Voy a tratar de explicar.
From states we assess on line A, but our practice is to assess on the greater of operating income or line A. Can you explain? Michelle, I'm going to turn that to you for.
Ok, esta pregunta la va a responder
Sure. So
Michelle.
the way the Procure report works is that the NOI is all of the revenue that was used for operations. Okay, so there shouldn't be an instance where your operating expenses exceed your operating revenues because you had to fund it somehow. So those two numbers in almost all cases should be equal. And so that's why if you have your operating expenses are higher than your operating revenues, you will get an email from me saying something's wrong with the Procure report. I don't randomly just make choices off of the Procure reports. Also, I want to reiterate that we do a webinar at the beginning of the year that explains how to do these Procure reports. And it is really important that they're done correctly and they're filed on time. So please keep your eyes open for that in January.
Sherry Lund,
Habrá algunos resultados sobre esto en enero. Manténgase informados porque Michelle no toma decisiones así acerca del revenue, del dinero.
Open budget item for assessment relief, but it's something that we have to build within the budget and live with.
Hay algo que tenemos que hacer con el presupuesto y pues ahí están las cosas. ¿Hay otra pregunta?
Flat formulas, and let me go back a little bit. There are formulas that apply the same percentage to all.
Las fórmulas se aplican al mismo por ciento.
Version of the Procure report income lines overall. Then there are formulas that have breakpoints and sometimes multiple breakpoints with different rates overall. So those were the differences in how we categorized tiered versus flat. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm just scrolling through here.
Yeah, so let me answer a question from Marjorie's son about process. Must the budget be voted on first and only then can the assessment formula be voted on? And that is correct. So that's baked into Canon, I think it's 18.02. It's frankly not that easy to read that canon, but it essentially says we have to vote on the budget first so that we know what assessment formula we need to have a balanced budget.
Tenemos que valorar nuestro presupuesto para ver qué fórmula de evaluación vamos a utilizar.
There are some that use multiple tiers, in fact, more than two. And again, there was a wide variety of practices overall. Lori Walton, apologies, you have to ask this again. We'll hopefully get the answer right. Bottom-up method of funding seems to be getting more and more unsustainable. Has there been any conversation brainstorming on how the diocese might support local congregations in identifying any other sources of income? To be honest, I'm not sure many of our churches can wait until the diocesan endowment is increased for us to find some sort of relief. That there haven't necessarily been specific congregations. There are certainly, there are others who can speak more effectively on this, but in terms of other strategies that are being implemented through Vital and Thriving and others, I think those are probably getting to the issue.
Pueden refrasear sus preguntas acerca de la fórmula de evaluación.
But certainly an issue that I think we're finding, and it's been a good part of the conversation, is that, while many were
Buena
impacted by the
parte de la
pandemic, that impact is
conversación
we hear that.
ha sido
Also
sobre
keep in mind that
la
there
forma
are
de
a
la
number of
evaluación.
grants that are available, many through the Episcopal Church, which is part of that body that we as a diocese pay into, and that's part of the benefit that we receive from the Episcopal Church.
Tengan en cuenta que tenemos dinero extra que podemos utilizar para la diócesis.
with that, maybe we move on, Michelle, to budget. Does that make sense?
Let's do it.
Ahora hablemos sobre el presupuesto.
Okay, hopefully the budget is up in front of you.
Pueden ver todos
And so
la
here's a
hoja del
couple of assumptions
presupuesto.
that we make with the budget. First of all, just kind of an overall comment, and this came up with one of the questions that we answered earlier, is that this budget is a relatively flat budget. While we do see a slight uptick overall in the funding going into congregations, it's a relatively flat metric at this point in time. We're also using an inflation rate of 2.9%. So that is a rate that is used from the CPI index that's specific for our geographical region. We use the June figures, which we are able to pull in July. And so that's how we get this 2.9%. The 2.9% affects the assessments, because as inflation goes up, the assessments
Este
will go down.
2.9%
And that is because
afecta
the minimum
la
wage and
evaluación.
salary increases with using that inflation number. And so less of the income going into congregations is assessed at the higher percent, more of it is assessed at the lower 5% number. So this also affects different COLAs in the budget. So let's go and look at this.
Este 2.9% está afectando el presupuesto.
In this budget, we're at $3.6 million and we have a reserve of $45,000.
Hay una reserva de
What happens if
$45,000.
the whole reserve isn't used? Well, part of this reserve is also used for assessment forgiveness. So every year, a call goes out for congregations who are having difficulties paying their assessment, and they can apply to the assessment review committee for assessment relief. So if you are in that position as one of your congregations, on the website, there is a link to a questionnaire, and you can fill that out.
Tienen preguntas relacionadas con este presupuesto.
Want to get the link quickly,
Pueden-
you can just drop me an email, and I'm happy to send it to you.
Pueden mandarle un correo electrónico a Michelle y ella les mandará este presupuesto para que ustedes lo vean, lo estudien detenidamente.
Level and for our institutions and congregations. Then, and this represents about 90%, close to 90% of the monies that we see coming in for ministry.
Todo esto representa el 90% de todo el dinero que se recibe.
Our endowments, which is at 4.5%. Is
Todo esto proviene de las
$354,000,
dotaciones.
up a little bit from the prior year. We use a rolling 4-year average.
Un
so
poquito
that we
de
can
las
ride out
finanzas
any of the changes
parroquiales,
in the market.
de la parroquia.
Again, this is key to lowering our assessments, getting the endowment income up. So which means that we need to increase the amounts that are invested. Now, this year is a special year in that we are looking to hire a canon for racial,
Este año
social, and environmental justice.
Estamos
The
pensando en
package all
contratar
in, per
a
year
estos
for 3 year period is
especialistas.
about $150,000. So the source of funding from this is coming from the Expanding Horizons project. And so,
El
as you will
incremento
recall,
del
several years ago,
crecimiento
when this
hispánico
started, there were amounts that were donated for leadership. And so out of that leadership
ha sido donado por los líderes, por el liderazgo.
We will be taking $150,000 a year to cover the salary and benefits for this.
Tomaremos $150,000 anuales para la nómina de esas personas.
That's coming in from Expanding Horizons is offset, as you'll see below, by the salary right here. So at this point in time, revenue neutral. So this $150,000, thanks to our generous donors in wanting to strengthen.
Gracias a nuestros donantes,
this is
las
how
dotaciones.
this can be put to good use this year. Then The other thing that's happening that's unique this year is we are in the midst of an election for our next bishop. And in this process, the decision was made to elect a bishop coadjutor. So having a coadjutor means that for a certain number of months, we will have two bishops at the same time. So we'll have our diocesan bishop, Bishop Mark, and also the bishop coadjutor, the newly consecrated bishop, and they will work as a team for a few months to do a seamless handoff, to be introduced to donors, to be introduced to the congregations. It's just a real gift to our incoming bishop to have the wisdom and expertise and knowledge that comes with Bishop Mark's extraordinary tenure over the last 17 plus years, and be able to pass off some of that wisdom and that information. So because we don't have this is not part of our typical budget to fund two bishops at the same time for a couple of months. We have drawn once again from the Expanding Horizons leadership line to fund this for a few months. And this will be up to, not to exceed, $150,000. So that would be salary, benefits, housing, etc. The deanery, that we have some deans, and they are being funded from the Expanding Horizons leadership line as well this year. Excuse me. And then we get into the other sources of funding. We have consistently been the recipients of Bishop Mark sharing part of his discretionary fund with the operating budget at $125,000 a year. We have planned giving fees. These are fees that we earn from managing portfolios and trusts, etc., from other donors. We have the endowment administration fees, which is similar. Benefit administration fees, this is managing the benefit program here. Small service fee that we collect for doing all the paychecks and the benefits. And then event fees. And this is if, like, for example, the youth group is going and doing something special and there's a nominal charge to get in and participate with that program. That's what that amount is. And then some interest income. So the totals for the sources of funds for ministry is a little bit north of $4.7 million. Then we're going to go to the working groups. And so the episcopate ministry is the office of the bishop. And this $500,000 number here is the salary, benefits, et cetera, or salary and benefits for the employees in the bishop's office. So it's the bishop, his executive assistant, and half of another employee. Here's the $140,000. This is the funds going out for the overlap period for the bishop coadjutor. And as you can see, this is a revenue neutral position right now, because we've got the $140,000 here coming in from Expanding Horizons and the $140,000 being spent here. So if we spend $100,000, then both of those numbers will change to $100,000, and there will be more funding available in the leadership line of Expanding Horizons. This is something that will not be repeated next year. We'll go back to that, the one funding one bishop. Most of these other items have not changed. So the archdeacon's salary, the school for deacons, executive council, etc. If we get down to this area right here, this is something that's a little bit different. These are accruals for future events. And so what we do is, let's take this one, for example. This one is the Bishop Election Fund. So when it comes time to elect a new bishop, it's a very expensive proposition. And
So básicamente está hablando sobre el presupuesto
we budget
de
an amount of funding, and we
una
set it aside so that when we
Un
have
presupuesto
new
general
bishops,
sobre
we have funds
salarios y
available for that.
gastos
What
y
we've done this
escuelas
year
y,
is we've applied a
y
2.9%
viajes
COLA
y
to this.
todo eso
It doesn't
que
mean it's
ustedes
going to do
pueden
that every
tener
year, but we're
personalmente
trying to
si le
be
mandan
more
un
realistic as we're moving forward. The
correo
same
a
with
Michelle,
travel for
ella
general
puede
convention. General
darles esta
convention is
información.
held every 3 years, and so this is
Es
accrued
un
each
presupuesto
year so that
generalizado.
entities can attend the convention with very little out-of-pocket expense. Travel for the House of Bishops. The House of Bishops meet twice a year, and so that's all bishops go to that and or as they're able, and so this helps fund that every twice a year. And then Lambeth is a meeting of all of the bishops of the Anglican Communion, and it's held in England, and so this is also an accrual that's made every year for 10 years, and then we spend and then we reaccrue. There's a bump in the bishop's travel and entertainment line item, and this is because with the new bishop coming on board, we'll send both bishops to General Convention and also anticipate some additional expenses for visitations and meeting different congregations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's up a little bit. This is diocesan events, basically the same, a flat number. And then the Episcopal residence, so this is the home that Bishop Mark lives in right now. And he has done a spectacular job of keeping up with repairs. So when he and Sheila leave the residence and we prepare it for the new bishop, we're allowing a few extra dollars to do any kind of minor repairs. And it may need painting, which we will need to take out of this line item. So we bumped it up a little bit as what we were able, given the budget influx. Congregational ministry is a working group that deals with the mission congregations. And so these numbers have been relatively flat. The salaries have been increased just for the COLA, the 2.9%. The medical has been increased for up to 5%. We don't have firm numbers on that increase, but we've been told that it should be about the same as last year. So we're being conservative with our budgeting. And dental, we have increased 3%.
So, la mayor parte del
I doubt that
presupuesto
the
del
dental will go
ministro
up
de
that much, but it gives us
congregación
a
va en
tiny bit of cushion. So
salarios
that's
y
why
en
you're seeing a little bit of a
apoyos de
bump in
misión,
those numbers.
programas de misión.
Ajá. And then in this case,
No
right
hay
here,
mucho
you
en
can see that the
publicidad,
down
en
events because we're down one
viajes,
employee.
en
And
el
then also
bienestar
in
de
the
los clérigos,
Episcopate
etcétera.
Bishop's office, we have
Supongo
an
que este
employee
es
who
un
was hired at a
presupuesto
lesser rate
anual.
than the person who was exiting, and so there was cost savings there too. And then we have, you can see that this went down from 5,000 to 500. The staff's been very conscientious about trying to make cuts and really living within our means. The Living Stones program does no longer exist, so that is why that one's zeroed out. And then basically the rest of these are about the same. Here's the expense line item for the canon for racial, social, and environmental justice that we mentioned before. This was the one. This one is revenue neutral because we've got funding from Expanding Horizons leadership line. The Lifelong Faith Formation is the working group that works with families, people of all ages with their faith formation. This is where the training is funded for anti-racism, for EFM, for other curriculum.
Otros diferentes tipos de programas
the whole and healthy
que van
church,
al
et cetera,
presupuesto
and
de
the
la
youth events. So
acción.
that's what this working group is about, and that's pretty much neutral, pretty much flat, the same as before. We also offer some support to our camps and campus ministries, and so we have 2 college chaplains that are funded with this line item, and then we also help support our 2 camps, the St. Dorothy's Rest and Bishop's Ranch. Communications is the working group that does the newsletters, does press releases.
Comunicación en el
something
ministerio,
happens, they
periódicos.
are the ones that
convenciones,
websites up and
internet,
rolling and help
los
promote
gastos de
their
tecnología y algunos viajes. ¿No
support to the
escuchó?
wider church. I think we've touched on this before. So
Apoyo
the
para
support to the Episcopal
ampliar
Church is
la iglesia,
it's a formula. It's a different formula
a la iglesia
than what we do
episcopal.
at the diocesan level. And this number, we use gross numbers. So there's more funding that's assessed than at the congregation levels from the PROCA reports. We fill out a report that's very similar to the PROCA report. This number is down a little bit this year because last year, or the year that we're in now, we were assessed on our PPP loans, and of course, in 2024, that will no longer be the case. And then also, as part of our Province 8, we also have an amount that we send to them. Then we have various commissions, the multicultural commissions, so those are flat. Different kind of support here for the police chaplaincy, disaster ministries, etc. Planned giving and stewardship. This is the one, the working group that does the stewardship webinars, who goes and solicits gifts from donors for various items, who is instrumental in facilitating and working major projects such as expanding horizons. So a really important piece of what we do. And again, this also involves TENS. I know that this group has been responsible for even going to congregations and creating adult education around stewardship. The finance office is the office that does the payroll administration, the financial statements, takes care of our annual audit.
El ministro de la oficina de las finanzas, que maneja la nómina y todo lo relacionado con los gastos más importantes.
Help keep me out of trouble with my discretionary fund. So we do a lot of that. And then the administrative ministry, this is just kind of the nuts and bolts. This is kind of like when you get down to your budgets at your church level, and it's like all the boring stuff. It's like the insurance and printing and maintenance, etc. So bottom line is that we're basically at a break even on this budget. So,
básicamente salimos empatados en este presupuesto. Generalmente dice que todo está bien. Pero enfatizo, si ustedes quieren tener esta información en su correo electrónico, solamente tienen que pedírselo a la señora Michelle Rakusin.
So I'm going to help start answering questions if I can. And the first one that I see that I can answer is from Lori Walton. Can you clarify who made the decision to have a bishop coadjutor? What diocesan body is responsible for that decision? And that is the bishop in consultation with the standing committee. It's a combination of what's provided under the canons of the Episcopal Church and under the diocesan constitution. I would point out for a bishop coadjutor, the canons allow a bishop coadjutor to serve in that role for as long as 36 months. We are calling for a much shorter transition period. And it's the most common way for these days for a transition to occur. And I think, certainly my judgment and a judgment would be that, for a bishop who served 18 years with us, which is a very long episcopate compared to the norm, which is closer to 10 years across the church, that kind of transition is quite short, and I think will be quite beneficial.
Okay, and then about the overlap number. So what we've done is we've taken 5 months just to be conservative. So
Nos ha tomado 5 meses para estar bien, pero nuestros números están bien.
And it includes benefits that salary, housing, pension, medical, and other benefits. as well as salary.
Yeah. And we may have some financial obligations to the new bishop coadjutor before the ordination date of May 4th. It's very common for people to start a little bit earlier than that so that they have time for a transition from whatever their current position is.
Yes, so the budget is posted on the website. It will also be in the packet for convention. Right now, we have current expense numbers through June. As soon as we close the September books, those numbers will be presented, and those will be part of the packet to convention.
Good question from Stephen on any delinquent parishes in the diocese, and I presume you mean from the standpoint of paying either assessment revenue or repaying the diocese for payroll and benefits that are administered by the diocese. All of these, any outstanding items are reviewed monthly by the Finance Committee and also by the Executive Council. And I can assure you, Michelle is very active in ensuring that congregations parishes are kept current, at least in their amounts owed to the diocese.
Yeah, and there are a few that are behind on assessments, and we're working very closely with them because remember that your assessment needs to be current in order to have full representation at convention to be able to vote. Yeah, Laura, we'll post the current budget. What we needed to do was wait for Executive Council approval, and so what we traditionally do is after this seminar, we'll post the numbers. So would you explain the rationale of using the expanding horizon funds for staffing positions? So the expanding horizon funds have various tentacles. They had various areas of interest. So part of them may have been for capital, but there is a leadership bucket, if for lack of a better word, and that leadership bucket, that group of funds has been used in the past for helping to fund the vice chancellor, and so now it will be used to fund the canon for racial, social, and environmental justice for a period of 3 years, and it will fund the overlap period for the two bishops as they're working together to hand over the work to the new bishop. So keep in mind that this isn't a decision that is just made by one person, because it goes through the whole process. It goes through the process of the budget committee. It goes through the process of the finance committee. It goes to executive council, and those numbers are presented to executive council when there is an ask for a certain amount of money, of like $10,000 or more in a year. That has to be passed by executive council. So executive council debated and voted on using the $150,000 for this canon position because they believed that that was really important. And also they debated and voted to use part of that leadership line item for the funding of the bishop coadjutor for the overlap period.
Right, I'm seeing a raised hand from Mary Frances Leopold, and we can't actually call on you through the raise hand function. So if you could type your question into the Q&A, we'll be able to try to answer it. Oh, and
Okay.
Mary Frances doesn't actually have a question, so thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, and again, these documents will be posted on the website when the seminar is over. Leonard, I'm really sorry. I'm not sure how to answer this. How does the come up with a proposal that encompasses both parishes and mission stations, including old and new programs for people of color? So part of what we're working toward, and this is just for the future, is the hiring of the canon for racial, social, and environmental justice, someone who can concentrate more fully and completely on that. But in addition to that, the bishop and his staff have been very active in working with these groups, and trying to address the needs, the specific needs of people of color.
¿Qué impacto tendrá este presupuesto en la valoración del diocesano este año que viene? Es una buena pregunta. El único cambio será entre el 16 y el 17%.
Michelle certainly does
en general.
analysis of what we think the assessment revenues would be, and that's the budget we have to live within.
Y es el presupuesto con el que tenemos que hacer nuestras cosas.
What revenues we have in, and we have our own internal constraints of what missions and programs do we want to support with the revenues that we have.
And two thoughts on the assessment structure. The first is that as our inflation numbers go up, the amount of funds from congregations that is assessed at 5% increases. So overall, the assessment numbers go down. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the amount over the this $90,000+ is assessed at 17%, nobody pays a congregation, no congregation pays a total of 17%. It's still a blended rate, so it's less than 17%.
Ninguna congregación paga más del 17%. Entonces, básicamente el presupuesto se mantendrá así.
Okay, well, we'll have these documents posted on the website shortly.
Estos documentos, toda esta información se pondrá en la página web después de este seminario. ¿Alguien tiene más preguntas? Estaré feliz de contestarlas, de ayudarles. Muchas gracias.
It's been lovely. Thank you, Lane. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Bishop Mark, for your prayer. And thank you, Miguel, for your translation services. And go in peace. Take care.
Thank you.